The institution of marriage in medieval Europe operated under fundamentally different principles than contemporary Western marriage. Rather than being based on romantic love or personal choice, medieval marriage functioned primarily as an economic and political arrangement between families. This examination reveals the harsh realities faced by medieval couples, particularly women. Within a system that prioritized financial gain and social advancement over individual welfare and happiness, medieval marriage practices, when examined through modern perspectives, reveal systematic challenges that affected every aspect of participants' lives. From childhood betrothal arrangements to the constant threat of death in childbirth, these unions represented complex negotiations between families seeking to maximize their political influence and economic security. The human cost of these arrangements was substantial, yet they remain the foundation of medieval social organization for centuries. Understanding these historical practices provides valuable context for appreciating the evolution of marriage as a social institution. The stark contrasts between medieval and modern marriage customs illuminate how dramatically social expectations, legal frameworks, and individual rights have transformed over the centuries. Child marriage economic transactions disguised as unions. The case of Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort's experience exemplifies the extreme nature of medieval child marriage practices. Born into nobility at the end of the medieval period, Margaret would eventually become the mother of the Tudor dynasty. But her path to that position began with childhood trauma disguised as strategic alliance building. At the age of 6, Margaret's guardians arranged her marriage to John de la Pole in what functioned essentially as a real estate transaction. Margaret possessed no understanding of the proceedings occurring around her. She was literally too young to comprehend the legal and social implications of marriage. The adults orchestrating this arrangement, however, understood precisely what they were accomplishing, securing control over Margaret's substantial inheritance through legal matrimony. The marriage existed purely on paper for Margaret, but the financial implications were immediate and significant for both families involved. When political circumstances shifted 3 years later, the guardians dissolved this marriage as though it had never existed and immediately arranged another union. This time, they selected Edmund Tudor, a 24-year-old man, to marry 12-year-old Margaret. Medieval law technically permitted marriage at these ages, and there existed an unspoken understanding that physical consummation should be delayed until the bride reached at least 14 years of age. Edmund Tudor, however, chose to disregard this convention entirely. Within months of their wedding ceremony, 12-year-old Margaret found herself pregnant, demonstrating the complete disregard for her physical and emotional well-being that characterized these arrangements. International examples of child marriage. Margaret's experience was not unique among medieval nobility. Isabella of Valois, daughter of the French king, was married to King Richard II of England in 1396 when she was precisely 6 years and 5 days old. Her trousseau, the collection of goods she brought to her marriage, included her dolls and miniature silver furniture designed for those dolls, highlighting the absurdity of treating a child as a bride. The wedding contract for Isabella's marriage specifically stipulated that consummation could not occur until her 12th birthday, acknowledging that even by medieval standards, this union was considered extreme. Yet the arrangement proceeded because the political and economic benefits to both kingdoms outweighed any concerns about the bride's welfare or development. These marriages represented calculated business transactions rather than romantic unions gone awry. Medieval parents were not inherently monstrous. They operated within a system that classified children, particularly daughters, as economic assets requiring strategic deployment. A daughter possessing land and titles represented a valuable commodity that needed to be leveraged before circumstances could diminish her worth. The economic logic behind child marriage. The urgency surrounding these childhood marriages stemmed from the constant threats facing medieval families. Wars, plagues, and political upheavals could eliminate a family's fortune overnight, making parents approach the marriage market with the desperation of day traders. They married off children as young as possible to secure alliances and guarantee wealth transfers before external forces could intervene. This practice was completely legal and socially acceptable among upper-class families. The church maintained rules regarding appropriate consummation ages, but enforcement proved spotty when significant political marriages were involved. Financial considerations consistently outweighed moral objections, creating a system where wealth and power determine ethical boundaries. The historical reality reveals that while these extreme cases generate shocking stories, most medieval people actually married much later in life. Peasants and middle-class families typically wed in their late teens or early 20s. Child marriage primarily affected wealthy families who possessed substantial assets to negotiate and leverage through matrimonial alliances. Nevertheless, for the Margarets and Isabellas of medieval Europe, childhood ended abruptly when adults decided their inheritance was more valuable than their innocence. These arrangements represented merely the beginning of their marital ordeals, as the medieval marriage system contained numerous additional traumatic elements that awaited newlywed couples. The wedding night, public spectacle, and private humiliation. The bedding ceremony tradition. Medieval wedding nights involved public participation that would seem shocking by contemporary standards. The bedding ceremony represented a tradition so intrusive that it transformed what should have been private intimate moments into community events. Understanding how these ceremonies functioned reveals the extent to which medieval marriage prioritized public verification over personal privacy. Following the wedding feast, the couple's friends, family members, and essentially anyone who felt entitled to participate would escort the newlyweds to their bedroom. This was not a simple escort service. These individuals actively participated in preparing the couple for their wedding night activities. Women in the wedding party would take the bride to the bedchamber, remove her clothing, arrange her hair, and place her in the bed while offering advice about the experiences awaiting her. Simultaneously, men would perform similar services for the groom, ensuring he was properly prepared for the evening's activities. After completing these preparations, they would bring the groom to the bedroom and make certain he joined his new wife in bed. The ceremony then continued with religious elements. A priest would bless the marriage bed for fertility, combining spiritual authority with the already overwhelming social pressure. Following the blessing came the stocking-throwing tradition, where bridesmaids and groomsmen would position themselves on either side of the bed and throw the couple as stockings at them. A direct hit supposedly predicted that the thrower would be the next person to marry, creating a game-like atmosphere around the couple's intimate moment. Witnessing and verification. The most uncomfortable aspect of these ceremonies involved the witnesses who remained present to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. These individuals would not observe the intimate act directly, as even medieval society maintained some boundaries regarding privacy. However, they would wait outside the bed curtains and expect evidence that consummation had occurred. The wedding of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1469 exemplifies how elaborate these ceremonies could become. This politically significant union attracted numerous noble guests who chronicled every detail of the bedding ceremony. The pressure on the couple was enormous because failure to consummate the marriage could result in annulment, which would destroy all the political alliances that had been carefully constructed through the matrimonial arrangement. The logic behind these practices stemmed from the legal and economic nature of medieval marriage. In a system where marriage functioned primarily as a legal and economic contract, consummation was the element that made the union official and binding. Without consummation, there was no valid marriage, which meant no inheritance rights, no political alliances, and no legitimate children could result from the union. Regional and class variations. While bedding ceremonies were real historical practices, they were not as universally implemented as popular culture often suggests. These traditions were primarily upper-class customs, and even among nobility, the most extreme versions were reserved for marriages with the highest political stakes. Common people typically conducted much simpler, more private affairs without the elaborate public elements. The ceremony's specific details varied dramatically based on geographic region and historical time period. In some locations, the tradition was more symbolic, with guests escorting the couple to the bedroom and departing with blessings. In other areas, particularly in Scandinavian countries, public bedding was actually legally required to validate the marriage, making it a governmental rather than merely social expectation. Even royalty eventually grew tired of this invasion of their privacy. King Charles I of England famously refused to participate in the tradition, barring the door to his bedroom and rejecting the custom entirely. However, the practice persisted for another century among various social classes, demonstrating how deeply embedded these traditions had become in medieval culture. For child brides like Isabella of Valois, the bedding ceremony served as a traumatic reminder that their childhood had officially ended, even when actual consummation was delayed. Isabella participated in this ritual at age 6, surrounded by her dolls, knowing that she was now legally someone's property rather than a protected child. These ceremonies represented more than mere tradition. They functioned as mechanisms of control, ownership verification, and public confirmation of what should have been the most private moment in a couple's relationship. Childbirth. Medieval Russian roulette. Margaret Beaufort's traumatic experience. Returning to Margaret Beaufort's story illustrates the nightmare that medieval childbirth represented for young women. When Edmund Tudor died of plague while Margaret was 7 months pregnant, she faced the terrifying prospect of traveling to Pembroke Castle during winter while heavily pregnant. For a 13-year-old girl, this journey represented an almost unthinkable physical and emotional challenge. On January 28, 1457, Margaret entered labor. Her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, documented the event and described it as miraculous that a baby could be born from so little a personage. This medieval terminology indicated that everyone present expected both mother and child to die because Margaret's body was so severely underdeveloped for childbirth. The birth proved so traumatic that despite Margaret marrying 2 additional times after Edmund's death, she never conceived another child. The damage inflicted on her 13-year-old body during that single childbirth was permanent and comprehensive. One horrific delivery had rendered the future mother of the Tudor dynasty sterile for life, demonstrating how medieval pregnancy could destroy a woman's body even when she survived the immediate ordeal. Margaret's experience was not unusual. It was simply better documented because of her elevated social status. Most medieval women faced similar risks with far less medical attention and historical recording of their suffering. Statistical reality of medieval childbirth. Medieval mortality statistics reveal the terrifying nature of pregnancy during this period. Approximately 1 in 3 women died during childbirth or from complications that developed shortly afterward. This means that every time a medieval woman became pregnant, she faced worse survival odds than a modern base jumper faces during their dangerous sport. The available medical care often made situations worse rather than better. Medieval birthing practices included bloodletting during labor, operating under the theory that women losing blood during childbirth needed to lose additional blood to maintain proper bodily balance. They employed birthing chairs that function essentially as medieval torture devices, designed to accelerate delivery but often causing more harm than assistance to laboring mothers. Wealthy women did not necessarily receive superior care. Isabella of Aragon died giving birth at 18 years old after days of agonizing labor. Despite having access to the best medical care available during her era, which consisted primarily of prayers and herbal remedies, she suffered through multiple days of agony before finally succumbing to complications. The pressure for continuous pregnancy. Noble women faced expectations to become pregnant immediately after marriage and to continue bearing children continuously until menopause or death, whichever occurred first. Eleanor of Aquitaine, considered one of the most powerful women of her era, survived 10 pregnancies, with each one representing a potential death sentence that she somehow managed to overcome. Most noble women endured 8 to 15 pregnancies during their lifetimes, creating a cycle of baby after baby after baby until their bodies simply could no longer sustain the physical demands. The pressure was enormous because producing heirs was literally their primary job responsibility within medieval marriage. A medieval wife who could not produce children, especially male heirs, was considered a complete failure in her most important role. The medical understanding of the time blamed women for all conception and fertility problems. Despite modern knowledge that male fertility issues cause approximately half of all conception difficulties, women who somehow survived multiple childbirths typically found themselves so physically damaged that the remainder of their lives was spent managing the consequences. Prolapsed organs, torn muscles, and chronic pain were simply accepted as the inevitable price of being a wife and fulfilling matrimonial obligations. The teenage pregnancy crisis. The most heartbreaking aspect of medieval childbirth was that many women were still teenagers when they began this potentially deadly cycle. Margaret Beaufort was 13 when she gave birth. Isabella of Aragon was considered mature at 18. Their bodies had not finished developing, yet they were immediately expected to begin the reproductive process that would likely kill them. Medieval marriage was not simply about finding a compatible partner, it was about locating someone willing to risk death repeatedly to continue the family bloodline. For women, saying I do was essentially agreeing to participate in a lifetime of medical Russian roulette where the house maintained a significant statistical advantage. The constant threat of death in childbirth created a psychological atmosphere where women could not afford to become too attached to life or to develop long-term plans beyond immediate survival. And heir production. Legal violence. When marriage meant murder. Writes the doctrine of reasonable chastisement. Medieval marriage laws extended far beyond mere unfairness to women. They created genuinely terrifying legal frameworks that sanctioned violence and control. Under the legal doctrine of reasonable chastisement, husbands possessed the legal right to physically discipline their wives for any behavior they deemed inappropriate, with reasonable being defined extremely loosely by medieval courts. Historical records document cases where husbands received legal clearance for beating their wives with sticks, provided the stick was no thicker than the husband's thumb. This rule of thumb became enshrined in legal precedent, creating a standardized measurement for acceptable spousal violence that demonstrates how systematically the law supported masculine authority over feminine autonomy. Henry VIII, legal spousal murder. Henry VIII represents the ultimate example of legal spousal murder, living at the intersection of medieval and Renaissance periods while utilizing medieval marriage laws to their most extreme conclusio. When his wives failed to provide what he demanded, specifically male heirs, he did not pursue divorce but instead had them executed using existing legal frameworks. Anne Boleyn's case exemplifies this systematic legal murder. When she failed to produce a male heir and Henry grew tired of her presence, he arranged for her to be tried for adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was practically non-existent, but medieval law defined a wife's adultery as treason against the crown because it threatened royal succession. The penalty for treason was death, providing Henry with the legal justification he needed. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536, following a trial that functioned essentially as a legal lynching. Her supposed crimes included adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, charges so ridiculous that even Henry's own counsel had difficulty making them appear credible. However, they did not need substantial evidence, they simply needed sufficient legal justification to eliminate an inconvenient wife. Catherine Howard received identical treatment when Henry discovered her past relationships and possible adultery. He did not hesitate to send her to the executioner's block as well. She was approximately 19 years old when she was executed, barely older than a teenager, yet the legal system treated her as a fully responsible adult deserving of death. Systematic legal oppression. The most terrifying aspect of these executions was that Henry was not being exceptionally cruel by medieval standards. This was medieval marriage law functioning exactly as it was designed to operate. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was tortured and imprisoned for years by her husband's political enemies with her husband's full cooperation, simply because she had become politically inconvenient. Divorce was essentially impossible under medieval law. The Catholic Church controlled marriage regulations, and they only granted annulments under very specific circumstances. Couples had to prove that their marriage was never valid initially, which usually required proving that it was never consummated. This demanded humiliating public examinations where women had to undergo physical inspections to prove they remained virgins. Even when couples could prove non-consummation, the legal process could take years and cost enormous sums of money. Most people simply could not afford the expense and time required to obtain an annulment, trapping them in unwanted marriages indefinitely. Women found themselves trapped in marriages with men who could legally beat them, rape them, and control every aspect of their daily lives. The law was absolutely clear: a married woman possessed no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even testify in court without his explicit permission. If a husband decided to imprison his wife in a tower for the remainder of her life, that was his legal right as her husband. Medieval law granted husbands comprehensive authority over their wives' physical freedom, financial resources, and personal decisions. When husbands wanted their wives dead, creative legal interpretations were readily available. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason could be fabricated with relative ease. And medieval courts were not particularly concerned with due process when dealing with inconvenient wives. Many women understood exactly what they were accepting when they entered marriage. They knew that matrimony meant surrendering all legal rights and placing their lives entirely in their husband's hands. However, they had no alternative choices available. And married women possessed even fewer options for survival in medieval society. When Henry VIII had 2 wives beheaded, he was not violating medieval law. He was utilizing it precisely as it was intended to function. The legal system was deliberately designed to grant husbands absolute power over their wives, including the power of life and death. Women who could not provide their husbands with desired outcomes could only hope their spouses would prove more merciful than the law required them to be. Economic bondage, the dowry system. Marriage as financial transaction. Medieval marriage functioned fundamentally as a business transaction where the merchandise happened to be human beings. The dowry system represented legalized extortion that could bankrupt entire families for generations. Modern relationships may involve financial pressures, but they pale in comparison to medieval dowries that could equal $500,000 in contemporary currency, sometimes significantly more. Isabella d'Este, one of the most influential women of the late medieval period, saw her family spend 3 years negotiating her marriage like a complex corporate merger. The dowry negotiations alone involved multiple rounds of competitive bidding, with different families offering increasingly outrageous sums to secure the matrimonial alliance. Her dowry included cash payments, jewelry, land transfers, and political promises that would require decades to fulfill completely. The twisted economics of marriage. The bride's family was not simply paying to remove their daughter from their household. They were essentially purchasing a son-in-law's protection and elevated social status for their entire family line. Families that could not afford adequate dowries faced impossible choices. Their daughters would either remain unmarried, which guaranteed poverty and social death, or marry so far beneath their social station that the entire family's reputation would be permanently damaged. The groom's family approached marriage as a calculated financial investment. They were not merely acquiring a wife, they were obtaining her dowry, her family's political connections, and any future inheritance she might receive from her relatives. Marriage was literally a business transaction where the bride functioned simultaneously as the product being sold and the payment being made for her own purchase. The situation became even more twisted after the wedding ceremony concluded. Once a woman was married, everything she owned, including the dowry her family had bankrupted themselves to provide, legally belonged to her husband. She transitioned from being her father's property to being her husband's property, and she brought her own purchase price with her as part of the transaction. Inheritance and widow poverty. The financial nightmare extended far beyond the initial dowry payment. Medieval inheritance laws were specifically designed to maintain wealth concentration in male hands, creating systematic impoverishment of women throughout their lives. When a woman's husband died, she frequently lost everything she had brought to the marriage and everything they had accumulated together. Widows regularly found themselves completely destitute because their deceased husband's property automatically transferred to his male relatives rather than to his wife. This created a vicious cycle where desperate widows would remarry quickly, not for emotional reasons or companionship, but purely for economic survival. Some women married 4 or 5 times during their lives, each time hoping the next husband would not die and leave them penniless again. Others were forced to enter convents, not because they felt religious callings, but because religious institutions provided the only alternative to starvation for women without male protection. Gaming the system. The most successful medieval women were those who learned to manipulate this rigged economic system to their advantage. Margaret Beaufort, despite her traumatic childhood experiences, eventually became one of the richest women in England by carefully managing her inheritances and selecting her subsequent husbands based on strategic considerations rather than emotional attraction. However, she represented a rare exception rather than a typical outcome. For most medieval families, arranging a daughter's marriage meant choosing between financial ruin and social disgrace. Some families literally went into debt for multiple generations to afford a single daughter's dowry. Others were forced to accept marriages that offered no social advancement and provided their daughters with no future security. The cruelest irony was that even after bankrupting themselves to provide adequate dowries, families had no legal recourse if the husband proved to be abusive or neglectful toward their daughter. Once the marriage was completed and the dowry paid, the bride's family possessed no legal standing to intervene in the relationship. The money was permanently gone. The daughter was legally dead to them, and they remained responsible for the debt incurred to arrange the marriage. Medieval marriage was not actually marriage in any meaningful sense. It was human trafficking with religious ceremonial elements attached. Medieval couples were not joining their lives together in partnership. They were completing business transactions that treated women as both commodities and currency within a larger economic system. The financial requirements for participating in this system were so extreme that they destroyed families for generations. Love, compatibility, and happiness were luxuries that most medieval families simply could not afford to consider. When a daughter's marriage could either elevate a family's social status or destroy it financially, romance became just another term for fiscal irresponsibility. The dowry system created a medieval economy where women's bodies and reproductive capabilities were literally traded like any other valuable commodity, with families engaging in competitive bidding to secure the most advantageous matches for their financial and political interests. Death, the only reliable exit strategy. Marriage duration and mortality. Medieval marriage contained an ultimate plot twist that modern couples rarely consider: all the trauma, financial ruin, and legal oppression we have examined typically did not need to be endured for very long because medieval marriages came with built-in expiration dates through death. The average medieval marriage lasted approximately 15 to 20 years, not because couples grew apart or developed irreconcilable differences, but because one spouse died. Usually the wife died first, thanks to the Russian roulette nature of childbirth discussed earlier, but husbands were not exactly achieving longevity either. Wars, plagues, and complete lack of medical knowledge about basic hygiene meant that death was a constant companion for medieval couples. The Black Death swept through Europe during the 14th century and eliminated roughly 1/3 of the entire population. Families could spend years planning elaborate dowries and politically significant marriage alliances only to have plague eliminate half the wedding party before the ceremony could take place. Suddenly, all those careful financial calculations became meaningless because the prospective son-in-law was dead in a ditch somewhere. Practical adaptation to constant death. Medieval people adapted to this constant threat of death by treating marriage like a revolving door system. Remarriage was not merely common, it was essential for survival in a society that provided virtually no support for single individuals. Widows and widowers would remarry within months, sometimes within weeks of their spouse's death, not because they were emotionally callous, but because remaining unmarried in medieval society was essentially a death sentence of its own. Some women became serial wives purely out of necessity. They would marry, survive a few years if fortune favored them, become widowed, then immediately begin searching for the next husband before their financial resources were exhausted. It resembled a grim game of musical chairs where the music could stop at any moment and leave participants without the support structures necessary for survival. Wealthy individuals possessed slightly more flexibility because they could afford to remain single for longer periods, but even they felt tremendous pressure to remarry quickly. Noble families would arrange backup marriages for their children, literally developing contingency plans for when the first spouse died predictably. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included specific clauses detailing what would happen when, not if, one party died. This demonstrates how completely normalized death had become within the institution of marriage. Religious acknowledgement of mortality. The normalization of death within medieval marriage was so complete that wedding ceremonies included prayers not only for the couple's happiness and prosperity, but specifically for their souls after death. Medieval priests would literally bless marriages while simultaneously preparing everyone present for the inevitable funeral that was probably approaching sooner rather than later. The constant threat of death created some genuinely bizarre inheritance situations. Some women outlived 3 or 4 husbands and accumulated wealth from each marriage, becoming incredibly powerful in the process. Others were less fortunate, losing everything each time they were widowed and having to restart their lives with nothing. Children from these serial marriages created incredibly complex family structures. Individuals might have half-siblings from their mother's previous marriages, step-siblings from their father's previous marriages, and no guarantee that any of these relationships would last more than a few years before another. Death reshuffled the family composition entirely. Medieval record keepers became experts at tracking these constantly changing family structures. Church records from the period read like soap opera scripts. John married Mary, who died in childbirth. John then married Susan, who died of plague. John then married Margaret, who outlived him and subsequently married Thomas, creating an endless cycle of matrimonial musical chairs. Psychological impact of constant loss. The psychological impact of this constant mortality was enormous. Medieval people could not afford to become too emotionally attached to their spouses because the statistical likelihood of losing them was so high. Marriage focused on survival and alliance building rather than emotional connection, partly because emotional connection was simply too risky when death was always lurking nearby. Despite all this death and trauma, people continued getting married, having children, arranging dowries, participating in wedding ceremonies, and facing down all the horrors we have discussed. This persistence occurred because in medieval society, even a dangerous, potentially deadly marriage was still safer than attempting to face the world alone. When medieval couples promised till death do us part, they were not being romantic or sentimental. They were being realistic about the statistical likelihood that death would separate them long before old age could. Death was the only reliable method of escaping a medieval marriage, and it usually arrived much sooner than anyone hoped or expected. Conclusion: the brutal reality of medieval marriage, when examined comprehensively, reveals an institution that bears little resemblance to contemporary matrimonial expectations. Child brides were sold like livestock in carefully negotiated financial transactions. Wedding nights became public spectacles that stripped couples of privacy during their most intimate moments. Childbirth functioned essentially as a death sentence that women faced repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. Husbands possessed legal rights that extended to murder under certain circumstances. Dowries bankrupted families for generations while providing no guarantees of security or happiness. Marriages rarely lasted long enough for couples to fully process the trauma they had endured because death intervened with statistical regularity. These historical realities provide valuable perspective on contemporary relationship challenges. Modern dating applications, relationship negotiations, and even divorce proceedings appear remarkably civilized when compared to the systematic oppression and physical dangers that characterized medieval marriage. Understanding these historical practices illuminates how dramatically social institutions can evolve over time. The transformation from medieval marriage as economic transaction to modern marriage as emotional partnership represents one of the most significant social changes in human history. The legal rights, personal autonomy, and physical safety that contemporary individuals take for granted in their relationships were literally unimaginable for most medieval couples. This historical examination demonstrates that appreciating current social freedoms requires understanding the extensive suffering that previous generations endured under different systems. Medieval marriage was not simply an earlier version of modern marriage. It was a fundamentally different institution designed to serve economic and political purposes at the expense of individual welfare and happiness. The evolution from medieval marriage practices to contemporary relationship structures represents centuries of gradual social progress that should not be taken for granted. When modern individuals complain about dating difficulties or relationship challenges, historical perspective reveals that they possess freedoms and choices that were completely unavailable to their Medieval ancestors. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from this historical analysis is recognition that social institutions we consider permanent and natural are actually human constructions that can be modified and improved over time. Medieval marriage seemed natural and inevitable to people living within that system, just as contemporary marriage practices seem natural to modern individuals. Understanding this historical perspective provides hope that further improvements in human relationships and social institutions remain possible in the future.